Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor, and I am so excited to welcome you today to talk about mapping the West. We're going to look at some historical maps of the American West, kind of following colonialism as it moved west and kind of up from the south. And we're here with our special guest today, Susan Schulten. She did this incredible Mapping the West folio that's in the current issue of Alta. And we're going to kind of go through it today and kind of dig a little deeper, explore more, take a look at maps, which even if you're not a map nerd, I've kind of become one just in putting together today's slideshow and learning more about this. A bit about Susan. She is a historian who uses old maps to explore the past. Her 2018 book, A History of America in 100 Maps, demonstrates that whether they're made for diplomacy or social reform, to encourage settlement or understand disease, maps reveal so much about our history. Susan teaches at the University of Denver and is working on a book about Richard Eddis Harrison, the 20th century artist whose unconventional maps introduced Americans to a new understanding of world geography. There's so much more about Susan. I encourage you to read her bio, but a fun fact is that next year she will be the state historian for Colorado. Is that correct, Susan?
That's correct. Yeah.
Very cool. Hi, Jersey Shore. Grace. Before we begin, a quick pitch for Alta Journal. Alta is an award-winning quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. This is our current issue, issue 29. It's been guest edited by William Deverell. He's the co-founder of the USC Huntington Institute on California and the West. And it's a really extraordinary examination, kind of a multi-part examination on reckonings with the West. And included in this beautiful issue is this folio. It's like a little keepsake, and Susan worked on it and made it. It's beautiful. We have a stack of extras in the office, and this arrived before the magazine, and we just fell madly in love with it. So it's fantastic. Please pick up a copy of the issue if you haven't already. You can also buy it at altaonline.com/store. I hope you consider supporting us as a member. I also want to invite you to events. Tonight, I will be at City Lights talking about independent publishing in California with Litquake. Tomorrow night, CBC, our California Book Club, is free. We're welcoming Tobias Wolff, the author of This Boy's Life. He'll be talking about that. Friday night, we have a huge event in San Francisco. Litquake and Alta present the California Book Club live with Andy Sean Greer, Maxine Hahn Kingston, Jaime Cortez in conversation with John Freeman. That's at the Verdi Club. A few tickets are still available, so grab them for that. And I'll stop selling you. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for Susan. We're going to chat for about 30 minutes as we look through some of these maps. And I see we have a lot of regulars here because they know that I love when people zoom in. Let us know where they're zooming in from. So hello to Massachusetts, Ramona, California, Eagle Rock, Ventura, Mojave Desert, White Salmon, Washington, Ukiah, San Francisco. This is great. Thank you so much for everyone for zooming in today. Susan, welcome to Alta Live. Thank you for joining us today.
This was a great project to work on. I had a great time.
Well, this is so gorgeous and cool, and it comes in your issue, folks. So grab it. Before I kind of dive into opening our little slideshow and going through some of these maps, can you briefly tell us kind of what was the assignment? What was the assignment you got from, I assume, Bill Deverell? And how did you go about putting this together? What archives did you use? How did you edit? How did you decide the 10 or 11 maps to include in this folio?
It's a great question. And you're right that Bill Deverell invited me. I've known Bill for many years. And if you don't know, he is a beloved historian, very much admired across the country for his generosity with colleagues and with the public, his roles at USC and the Huntington. And so I was pretty honored to get the call from him. And he let me know that he was guest editing this issue of Alta, kind of thinking about all the ways in which we have to reckon with the West, right? All the ways in which it's a symbol of promise, but also represent some of the deepest challenges that we're facing, both historically and in the future. And the call was specifically to develop a portfolio, like you said, to think spatially and visually about the West. Are there maps that through time could tell us something about the uniqueness of the West? And so it was pretty challenging for me, and something that I was in part set up to do because, as you mentioned, my last book was A History of America in 100 Maps, which forced me to get way out of my comfort zone and go back to the 15th century, think about the earliest European explorations of what was then called the New World, and to think about maps way back, thematically way beyond my comfort zone, and then very much in the forward through the 20th century. To be honest, I had two criteria, and they're more practical than you would think. One is, what could reasonably be reproduced and be legible, right? Because some of the most important maps that we think about in terms of state power are really difficult to read. They're highly detailed, they've deteriorated. So it had to be something that was legible, and also something that told us something new or unique about the West. And I hope that most of the ones I chose did that, delivered on that. As you know, as you can tell, some of them are high politics and diplomacy, but others are ephemeral. But in that ephemeral nature, they can tell us so much about how the lived experience of the West can be understood.
Well, I know it's way more fun to see maps than me ask
Than to
questions.
talk about that.
So let's dive in, and we're gonna kind of start as your folio starts. Can you tell us about this one?
Yes, this is a map that I use a great deal when I train teachers to use maps in the classroom, which I do a lot. It's also been included in the new edition of my primary source textbook for college teaching. This is a map made by Sebastian Münster. Now, every version of this map that you see will be colored differently because it's hand colored. So if you have the opportunity to Google Sebastian Münster and his map of the New World, you'll see that it looks different depending on which copy it is. This one is from a wonderful California dealer, Barry Ruderman in La Jolla. He's known as one of the most generous and kind and knowledgeable map dealers in the world. And this was one that he sold many years ago. Sebastian Münster's map is important for several reasons, but part of what I encourage your audience to notice and to pose questions about is it's both really contorted and also a little bit recognizable. The recognizable parts are probably in your mind, in your eyes, the Southern Hemisphere. And that's a reminder that the Spanish and the Portuguese were pretty focused on the Caribbean and South America first, right? And this map, published in the 1540s, there are different states of it, but mid-16th century, gives us a very particular moment in time. By this time is no question that when Columbus sailed west, he happened on a new hemisphere, not Asia, which of course he went to his death believing. Here you now understand that the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, is an entirely separate continent or continents. And so this map is unique for being the first to represent on a single page both North America and South America, or the Americas, right? And that's what part of what made it unique. And then the contorted part that I mentioned is, of course, North America, and to a lesser extent, Central America. The reason for that is that the Spanish and Portuguese were only moving further north once they couldn't find a passage to India across the isthmus. Once they realized that Central America actually connected North and South America, they kept pushing further north. And you can see that big indent of water at the top of the map, right to the left of the Spanish flag. That was the fabled Sea of Verrazano. And what's important there is the hope was that there was a small isthmus of land that you could easily portage across, and then you can make your way to the real mother lode, which was Asia. That's, of course, where everyone was seeking a new trade route. And so the contorted part of North America, what we eventually know as North America, our home, the United States, it's contorted because there's a sense of hope there, a fantasy about how easy it will be to cross somewhere at Pimlico Sound, North Carolina. That's not true, of course, but that gives you a sense of both how much knowledge they had gained in the Americas, but how little they still understood. I'll stop there in case, Beth, you have some more
Well,
focus.
yeah, what is Zipengiri
Japan.
over?
Yeah,
Oh,
Zipangi are also known as Japan. And those are Marco Polo's 7,448 islands, which was a well-known figure. So they're trying to represent, right, that we now know that Asia is not the same as what we've been looking at for the last 5 decades, right? Columbus was indisputably wrong. But beyond that, we're still trying to figure out what's China, where is India, how big is this landmass we have to get across to get there.
wild. They nailed Florida though. Look at I mean, they really got
Florida does very well on Spanish maps.
All right. So we've got this is an island in the land. Tell us about this.
Are
This
we
is
on to
looking
the
more
next one?
correct.
Yes, this one I like. Part of what's so great about these early maps, I mean, of course, you referenced colonialism and history of exploitation, if not genocide. We're dealing with a very dark period of history. But the fascinating and curious part for me is always to try to remember that maps are a combination of argument and best knowledge, right? That so there is a way in which, like you just mentioned, the landmass is getting more recognizable. It's getting more familiar. And yet this is a sales pitch like no other. What we've got here is Henry Briggs, an Englishman, who is really trying to sell Virginia. He's an investor in the Virginia company, which was really, really struggling, as we know, until they pivoted toward tobacco and, of course, enslaved labor. And so what Briggs is trying to sell here is investment in the Virginia colony. And you can see that Virginia is on the map very prominently. And so all the details on the map comport with that sales pitch, that you don't want to cross North America to get to this fabled Asia or fabled passage to India. You don't want to do that across the center of the continent, Spanish land, right? Don't do that. They are not friendly. The indigenous people are hostile and the Spanish crown is hostile. Instead, if your audience wants to zoom in or look at their hand copy, they'll see that Briggs has noted all the waterways that come down through Virginia, Beth, your neck of the woods, and that these are going to offer a really easy way to get into the interior. And from there, it's not going to take long to travel northward, right, to the Great Lakes, to Hudson's Bay. And from there, he's saying it's a hop, skip, and a jump to the Pacific. The other big, interesting thing about this map is that California is represented as an island, which would continue more or less, this is a little out of my wheelhouse, but map scholars see that showing up well through the end of the 17th century, right? So it's a mystery or a myth that lasts really until about 1700.
Why were they so convinced it was an island?
I think that what I have read is that there was misperceptions, much in the same way that the Sea of Verrazano that looked so close to the Atlantic was people misapprehending the light off of water in the interior and thinking, oh, that's an ocean. There was some of that in the West, right? Also, there's also a fabled Sea of the West, which is sort of this massive interior sea that would be just here on the map, would be just west of Hudson's Bay. So this hope that there were just all these massive waterways that would either take us, if they were rivers and we could get to the headwaters, or lakes, interior lakes that we could get across. But with California as an island, that's a myth that gets started pretty early and endures, I think, Beth, in part because there's not a lot of European exploration of what your audience calls home. The West is pretty far, right? Most of what we know about North America from reconnaissance is the French in the interior and the English and the Dutch along the coasts.
All right, we're gonna take a big turn now and look at the mining map.
That was a big jump, wasn't it?
It's a big jump. It was a big jump in the folio. But this is really my neck of the woods. I can see my house almost.
Oh, say more. Where are you?
I am in Marin. I am in Novato, right in the wetlands. So San Pablo Bay, we can look across, like right now, I could look across and see San Pablo Benita, like over there.
Yeah, yeah. And I went to Berkeley, so some of this is familiar to me.
Okay.
Well, I knew that I wanted to include a map of the precipitating cause of massive in-migration to California. And about that was, of course, the mineral rush, the gold rush. And those maps are pretty interesting. Some of them are not very dynamic. In other words, they're pretty hardcore practical sketches of the area right around Sutter's Mill. They're not very exciting to look at. This one I like for a couple of reasons. One is that it again was offered up to me by Barry Ruderman, who deals in a lot of these Gold Rush era maps. Part of what I like is the contrast between the total chaos on the ground in California. Hundreds of thousands of people coming to this area in 49, 50, 51, and the placidity and organized calmness of the map. I mean, look at the way the map maker has very carefully shaded county divisions, as if somehow that's the key to understanding the several 100,000 young men who are causing chaos in this area. The greed, the lust, the violence, the excitement. And the map totally belies that. It doesn't represent that at all. And I love that way in which maps are constantly showing us an area that let's say, maybe is our best version of it, right? Our greatest hope for it. And this is kind of what the California map represents to me. It's also interesting because there's quite a bit of information on the map. It's showing you not just the development of the gold mines, but I think I noted this in the paragraph, but if I didn't, please let me know the recent discoveries of quicksilver, which were just south of San Francisco, which were becoming important for early industrialization back east. So there's a lot going on in this little map, but I remember the editors and I both agreed that given how pivotal the gold rush was to the state's history and to the history of the West generally, right? I mean, where I'm from in Colorado, the Pikes Peak gold rush had a similar effect, sparking the migration of 100,000 men, either overland or by sea through the Pacific to the Front Range, you know, devastating to the Arapaho and the Cheyenne nations that had called that home.
In terms of this particular map, it seems like we're getting into some topography. I mean, and obviously these maps, as you know, technology develops, are getting more and more accurate in terms of that. Is that, first of all, how correct is this? I realize these counties have changed, but are they getting better? Are they more accurate?
I think that's a great observation. I've recently been doing a lot of research on an area that's very close to my heart, the Eastern Sierra, through the late 19th century into the early 20th. And what I see in some of these maps when some of the first white folks arrive is a combination of knowledge, like I said, sometimes gleaned from native networks and sometimes from white reconnaissance exploration. So both a combination of reconnaissance, actual knowledge, and aspiration. To me, it's kind of interesting to, if you look at the foothills up into the Sierra Nevada, you can notice how stylized the representation is.
Yeah.
Right? That it's made to look very appealing. It's not made to look very threatening or, what do I want to say, forbidding. And so part of what this map is serving to do is invite people, I mean, if anything, it shows like, you can do this, right? Come here. It's not sending a signal that this is not terrain that can be mastered or traversed, right? So to answer your question, there's always a combination. There was exploration of the Sierras in the 19th century before this. There's quite a long history of not just indigenous, like I said, but other European exploration up and down. But it took a long time for explorers, surveyors to really understand both the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains where I am.
How long? I'm just going to dive in with we'll get to audience questions, but I ask questions like a very interested high school student. That's kind of my level of expertise here. So this map is by William Jackson. how long did it take him to put together? And is he going out and saying, all right, who's figured out El Dorado? Show me what you got in El Dorado. I mean, he can't have done all of this himself on foot in 1851. How did he put this map together? What was his
Well,
process like?
Jackson was a mining engineer. He was on the ground, but you're absolutely right that his knowledge would have been partial. And I believe he was based in San Francisco. But the Coast Survey, which had, after the end of the US war against Mexico, when the far west becomes American US territory, one of the first things the US Coast Survey does, which is a federal agency devoted to mapping, sends its best folks out to the west, many of whom were German immigrants, and had them map the coastal waterways, the inland waterways, and some of the foothills. So there was growing knowledge of this area. You also have John Fremont and his engineers on multiple expeditions throughout the 1840s west, even before this was US territory. John Fremont then becomes the hero of the Bear Flag Rebellion, which creates California independence in the middle of that war. So there's a lot of pretty high-powered explorers, surveyors, draftsmen who are in the West messing around in the 30s and 40s, much to Mexico's chagrin, of course. And that is partly what leads to the conflagration over the territory.
And also, am I seeing the San Andreas Fault here right along Santa Clara and Mariposa, Tuolumne, San Joaquin? Is that
That's a
that
great
kind of like
observation. I missed
mountain
that.
range?
Yeah. Good eye. Yeah.
This is earthquake country. That's a San Andreas. That's trouble right there.
Mhm.
All right, so this is one of the most interesting. I did a zoom in on the next slide so we can dig a little deeper, but will you please give us the overview of this map?
Yeah, this is one that I never tire of thinking about. It's the late 19th century, it's the 1880s, and it might look familiar to your audience because this is the era of the Sanborn maps, of the ethnic block by block mapping that was really taking off, largely being used by Hull House reformers or sanitary engineers in New York trying to improve the cities, right? Better materials, better education, better sanitation. But what's fascinating to me is that the example we have of that block by block reform mapping in San Francisco is by the city fathers, hoping to improve the city. But what they're laser focused on here is the threat posed by Chinese immigrants. And this is part of that wave of anti-Chinese sentiment in the 1870s and 80s, in part fueled by the end of the Transcontinental Railroad when labor upheaval led to scapegoating. I mean, this is an old story in American history, right? We depend on immigrant labor until we don't have purposes for it. And it seems the Chinese were the worst kind of victims of that in the aftermath of the mining boom and the railroad construction, when many of them migrated to San Francisco for camaraderie, for economic reasons, for safety. And the very fact of converging created a growing tension between the white settlers, white residents in San Francisco, and the Chinese. So what you're looking at is a map. It's gorgeous, right? It's
The color
beautifully.
coding, though, is fascinating.
Yes, and I see that you've zoomed in. He's used
Yeah, well, I
beautiful
want folks
color.
to understand the way that this was broken down.
That's right. So what have we got there? I just lost. Let's see. You can help me.
We have general Chinese occupancy in kind of this peachy
Tan,
orange.
yeah, right.
Then Chinese gambling houses in pink,
Mhm.
Chinese prostitution
In green.
in green, opium resorts
Yep. Opium
in
dens in yellow.
yellow. What is the
The
Chinese?
Chinese joss houses are houses of worship. So this is, where they're undertaking their quote unquote pagan rituals. And then what's most fascinating is that last color, right? White prostitution in blue. So they've taken care here to separate Chinese prostitutes from white prostitutes, because part of the argument was that the Chinese are seducing young white women. They're getting them hooked on opium. They're getting them into the neighborhoods, and then they're taking them into a life of vice. And this is one of the many concerns they have about the Chinese. Now, a lot of this is just, it's simply not even veiled racism, right? And what we see in San Francisco and California is the first experimentation at exactly this time of separating out a racial group. The Chinese Exclusion Act is the first example we have in American history of a single group being set apart and excluded in terms of immigration. It sets up a standard that we follow down to our own day, right? Targeting certain groups, but this is the first. And it's fascinating that it happens in the West Coast. In other words, it's a federal law, but it's coming out of pressure in California, which I think is quite interesting.
Is
California sort of
DuPont Street
often,
now Grant? I feel like
oh,
this,
here I'm going to defer to you as the local.
I think that DuPont Street is now Grant Avenue. Like, um, and Waverly Place is a teeny tiny little alley. I mean, this is so interesting. I've spent a lot. I love Chinatown. Today's Chinatown. It's a
Yeah, it's still
beautiful and
vibrant, right? Isn't
vibrant
it still
neighborhood.
one of the most robust? Yeah.
Yeah, this is
Which is
extraordinary.
ironic given the point of the map, right? The point of the map is to get rid of this settlement, and it persists.
Yeah. And I kind of did a zoom in here, but I've since learned how to zoom. All right, let's keep moving, grooving. The arid region. What is this? This
Yeah.
we put on John, our creative director,
Mhm.
put this on the cover of the folio. Can you tell us about this one?
Yeah, and I think this is the one that initially hooked your editors when they asked me for some ideas, and I knew this one. This one is, it's beautiful and important. And essentially what you have here is John Wesley Powell, who will be a name familiar to many of your readers, right? A hugely important explorer, hero of the Civil War, but also someone who warned Americans throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, sorry, 1870s, 80s, and 90s, about the aridity of the West, that west of the 100th meridian, you cannot rely on rainfall to sustain agriculture. And so all through the late 19th century, when the optimism about the West is at its peak, he is reminding people, this does not look like the eastern half of the United States, right? He argues for a lot of skepticism around the Homestead Act. You can't sustain agriculture with 160 acres. You have to have irrigation. And so what you're looking at here is a map that he created to testify before Congress that there should be a different way of organizing the West, that administrative units don't follow a grid, right? So the rectilinear pattern that we're so enamored with all these surveys in the General Land Office, they don't really match the way we think about and live in the West. What we need to be the governing principle of the West is watersheds. And if you understand watersheds, he was saying, and understand different ways of sharing water, community resource allocation around water, you'll have a much better chance of succeeding agriculturally in the West. So this was part of the colors that you're seeing are different, not all single watersheds, but portions of watersheds that to him were much more quote unquote sensible units to organize the West than a grid. That's what he's trying to do here. And he's warning us that the future will be very, very marginal in terms of water.
And these are hand painted. I mean, these are clearly
Hand colored, yeah.
beautifully.
They might be chromolithographed actually, because by the end of the Civil War, that technology had taken off. So it might be, in fact, I think it is a color lithography.
Oh. Okay, we're gonna get back to water in two more, but first, ladies, votes for women, a
A happy
success.
story. You know? This is something I've worked on quite a bit in the last few years, sparked in part by the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which we had in 2020, right? 1920. And so what I was mostly taken by, and you can imagine how I just went crazy, is that the more I dug into the suffrage movement and the temperance movement, relatedly, the more I saw that they were using maps. They were using maps to argue for their cause. And the way it's going to be particularly fascinating to your readership is this. The earliest successes for the suffrage movement were the West. Now, it's complicated, right? Why did it succeed first in Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, the interior West? It's different in each one of those. The Mormons wanted to enfranchise women in order to strengthen the Mormon church, to attract women. In Colorado, it had to do with a kind of coalition of reformers around populism and silver. In other words, the fact that these interior states are first to go towards suffrage doesn't mean that the West is somehow more egalitarian or more sympathetic to women's rights. There's a lot of other reasons. In California, Oregon, and Washington, you can see 1910, 11, and 12. Those were the big wins in the West for obvious reasons, right? More population. And once those got locked in, the women started to draw maps and to show the West as this white mass, which took up, a third of the country, and like saying to their advantage, look at how the momentum is shifting. Look at how women are moving suffrage from west to east. Now, the critics had a field day with this. They said, you know what, hardly anybody lives out there, which was true. That was a fair criticism, right? But geographically, in terms of space, they were leveraging all those wins in the West to say that, look, the map proves that the future is one with equal suffrage, with women's suffrage. So on the left, you have a typical one. Go ahead. Yeah.
Both of these maps are from 1915. I mean, there were people, right?
There were people, but not anything. I mean, the most populous states in the Union were consistently defeating suffrage. New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, right? That they were not gaining ground, and they were pretty frustrated by it. And so these maps are part of that effort to sell suffrage in a more persuasive way, to use visuals, right? To use a more engaging way. And what's fascinating to me is that in the teens, right, when these are happening, it's a high point of frustration because New York has just defeated suffrage, Pennsylvania, Ohio, but they're toggling between state level efforts and a federal amendment. So they're trying this kind of two-pronged approach, if you will. And if you can leverage enough power at the state, if you get enough women to vote at the state level, we might be able to force the issue in Congress. And so it's that wonderful interplay between let's focus on states, let's force the issue nationally, that I think is so fascinating.
And this is just beautiful. I like it.
Yeah, it is. And the one at the lower right, as you said, is from the New York campaign of 1915, and they failed. Tammany Hall shot it down, but they succeeded 2 years later in 1917, and that was the clincher. Once New York went, Wilson seems to fall in line. They get those last few senators, and it happens.
And you and I are allowed to vote now.
Woo!
All right, 2 more maps. We've got why not free water? Because of the cost. What is this one?
Like I said, I am utterly fascinated with the Eastern Sierra. Many of your audience knows this is a story that was dramatized in Chinatown, but the story goes much, much deeper than that. And what we have is a situation where the city fathers and engineers in LA knew that there was no way for this region to grow without importing a water supply. And they got so much water, they were so successful that they actually enabled the growth of Southern California. That's one of the ironic stories that we learn in all the wonderful histories of California. Bill Deverell knows this well, that the ability to import water, to hijack water from the Eastern Sierra, meant that Southern California could host an enormous population and an agricultural population, which of course would not have been possible. What you're looking at here is the backside of a utility bill from 1922. So we didn't put the dimensions on there, I don't think, but I'll show your audience, it's a little postcard. They send it to you, you pay your water bill, and on the other side, they're trying to explain your water rates. And they're explaining that, your water comes a long, long way through the LA aqueduct, the greatest engineering marvel of that time, right? Transporting water hundreds of miles from its source down to your tap. And that's why it's not free. To me, this is one of those examples like we talked about earlier, Beth, of just an ordinary map, an ephemeral map, telling us how these things navigate our lives. I realize I'm calling this a map when, some might take issue with that, but to me, it's mapping a map, right? And it's trying to explain a very real and very important reality of Southern California history. One that, you couldn't have scripted it. They're sending this to all their users in the Department of Water and Power, and, talk about a powerful agency, an agency that made LA possible, right? Through a pretty complicated history. And that's a story for a different time, but many of your readers will know that story.
Well, and it's also just, it's for visual learners. Here, this is why it costs so much. We're going to show you with a picture.
Yeah, and as someone who made that drive every year for 50 years of my life, to a fishing camp in the Eastern Sierras where I spent time with my family, it really resonated with me when I saw it online.
All right, we're going to end in 1949.
Yeah, this is
What
one
is
of the,
a pilot's eye view? This is the air maps of United Airlines.
yeah, this is a technique that might be familiar to some of your listeners, because Hal Shelton is best known for his ski resort maps. He's a hero here in Colorado, for showing us these beautiful topographic bird's eye views of some of our most important ski resorts and the Front Range more generally. But before he did that, I think he made an incredible contribution by helping pilots see the land beneath them. And so what you're looking at here is his collaboration with the Jeppesen Map Company for United Airlines in the 40s, where he's trying to draw a map, and the emphasis is on draw here, it's painted, but without a legend. And so Shelton believed that the successful map is one that you don't need a legend to read. In other words, it makes sense to the eye because the eye perceives topography. You can see the land on this, and that may sound ordinary to us because we live in his wake, right? But he's the one who's pioneering. There are other 19th century antecedents to this, but he's one of the most successful in the 20th century as kind of pioneering a technique, if you will, to show a version of the land that is very easily apprehended by pilots. This is, if you think about the 40s, this is the advent of early commercial air travel.
Sure.
And so helping people understand how the journey that they're taking is unfolding on the ground. I think Shelton is just brilliant for his ability to use artistic techniques, and he had training in scientific illustration, not map making, and to leverage those for a new kind of map that became so widely used by Jeppesen, which was a very important supplier of what they call charts. If you call the Jeppesen company today, they'll tell you these are charts, not maps, which I think is an interesting distinction.
Oh,
yeah, they're air
noted.
charts. Yeah.
We have gone so far over time. This
I know.
fascinating. It is so much fun. You must be your students' favorite teacher. It is so much fun to
I'm not sure about
learn
that.
this way. I would have benefited from the postcard telling me why my water costs so much because I'm a visual learner. And this is so helpful just in terms of, understanding our understanding of the West as it has grown, at least through the eyes of, for the most part, white colonizers and settlers.
They
One
are fun.
last,
They're wonderful ways to learn about history. And with the digital age now, so many great collectors have put their materials online that there's just an abundance. Yeah.
One last question for you. Just as we talk about Indigenous people and as this land has been here forever, did Indigenous peoples create maps of their own, and do any of those still exist?
Absolutely. And I've treated some of those in A History of America in 100 Maps. Sometimes they look a little different. I mean, sometimes they look like our maps in terms of representing space in a Cartesian way, right? Physical distance. The ones that I find most fascinating are from the early 18th century, which are on deerskin, and they represent relationships as opposed to just space, so that the tribes are represented in terms of size, in terms of their power, whom they're connected to, whether it's the colonies or other bands of their confederacy. So those are called the deerskin maps. And if your audience wants to Google those, they'll find several editions in British libraries because they're from the 18th century. But closer to the West, what's really interesting to me is the way that many Indigenous tribes represented space in terms of time it took to traverse it. And so some of the intel that helped people like Lewis and Clark had to do with conveying information about how long it would take to traverse, say, a particular mountain chain. And that's an interesting way to represent space as well. But others are simply maps that we would recognize, right? Maybe not as sophisticated if you think about advantages of publishing, advantages of scientific instruments, but certainly some of the similar things. But they're wonderful to use with students because they show you that maps are representations of relationships, whether that's geography, power, economics, networks, other things. Yeah.
Business.
Business.
Susan, this has been so interesting. I am so grateful to you for taking the time on your sabbatical back east to join us and for this incredible folio that you worked on and put together that is such a treasure inside our Treasure of a magazine. So thank you so much for your enthusiasm and joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, I want to make sure you are reminded next week we had a last minute cancellation. I'm working on filling it in. I'll keep you posted. But Friday night, if you're in San Francisco at the Verde Club, we would really, really like to encourage you to come join us. You can buy tickets on litquake.org. To that, it's going to be fabulous. We have a Joan Didion impersonator who will be in the house. Going to be great, live music, a giveaway, and of course, incredible authors. And again, tomorrow night, Tobias Wolff via Zoom at the California Book Club. And also, if you're in LA, save the date. We're going to talk about issue 29 at the Huntington with Mr. Deverell himself, our shared favorite historian. That's November 19th. So we've got a lot going on here at Alta. We are grateful that you joined us at Alta Live today. And another big thank you to Susan Schulten. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Take care, everyone.